The morning sun painted the hills of exclusive Ridgemont Heights in shades of gold and privilege. Behind wrought iron gates and manicured lawns sat mansions that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. This was where America's elite lived, worked, and decided who belonged. At the main entrance to Ridgemont Estates, a security checkpoint gleamed white and pristine. Cameras monitored every angle. Guards in crisp uniforms patrolled with military precision. And at the center of it all stood Victoria Sterling, head of security, her silver hair pulled back tight, her navy blazer spotless. Her authority absolute. Victoria had been guarding this gate for 12 years. She knew every resident by name, every car by sight, every delivery schedule by heart. In her world, order mattered. Protocol mattered. And maintaining the character of this neighborhood mattered most of all. She'd seen what happened when standards slipped, when the wrong people got through, when property values dropped because someone got soft on security. That's why when she saw the man approaching the gate on foot, sweating through a gray hoodie and worn basketball shoes, every alarm in her head went off. He wasn't driving a luxury car. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't even have a visitor's pass. He was just walking up the hill, breathing hard from what looked like a long jog, heading straight for the main entrance like he owned the place. Victoria stepped out of the security booth, her heels clicking against the asphalt with authority. Her hand moved instinctively to the radio clipped to her belt. In the distance, she could see the man more clearly now. African American, maybe 50 years, old, tall, and lean from running. His hoodie had a small tech company logo she didn't recognize. His shoes had seen better days. Everything about him screamed outsider. "Sir," Victoria called out, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "The main gate is for residents only. Deliveries and visitors use the side entrance down the road." The man slowed his pace, but didn't stop. He pulled earbuds from his ears and looked at her with eyes that seemed tired, like he'd had this conversation before. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, almost gentle. "I live here," he said simply. Victoria's eyebrows rose. She'd heard that line before from door-to-door salespeople, confused delivery drivers, even homeless individuals looking for a warm place to rest. They all had stories. They all had explanations. But none of them belonged here, and neither did this man, sir. "I'm going to need to see some identification," she said, stepping closer to the gate controls. "All residents have vehicle access codes and identification cards. I don't see either." The man reached the gate and stopped. He wasn't aggressive or demanding. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, breathing slowly as his heart rate came. "Down from the run, I went for a jog," he said. "I didn't think I needed my wallet to come home." Victoria almost laughed. Home, as if a man in a $15 hoodie and scuffed sneakers could afford a $7 million mansion. As if someone who jogged on public streets instead of private gym memberships belonged in Ridgemont Heights. She'd seen this before, privileged people who thought confidence could substitute for credentials. "Sir, I understand your position, Victoria," said her tone, professional but firm. "However, I cannot allow access without proper identification. If you're a resident, you'll have your access card, your vehicle, or at minimum, verifiable contact information for the homeowner who can confirm your identity. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from by dropping your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they're dressed, hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden Sparks. These stories matter, and we're grateful you're here to witness them." The man studied Victoria's face for a moment. Something flickered in his expression. Not anger, but recognition, like he was seeing something he'd hoped he'd left behind years. "Ego, what's your name?" he asked quietly. Victoria straightened. "Victoria Sterling, head of security for Ridgemont Estates." "And yours?" "David," he said. "David Washington." Victoria nodded curtly and reached for her tablet, scrolling through the resident directory. "Washington, Washington," she muttered under her breath. No David Washington in the system. No recent purchases. No rental agreements. Nothing. "Sir, there's no David Washington listed as a resident or approved visitor in our system," she announced, loud enough for the approaching security guard to hear. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." David Washington didn't move. He looked past Victoria through the ornate iron bars of the gate toward the winding road that led up the hill to his home. The house he'd bought with cash 3 years ago. The house where his wife was probably making coffee in the kitchen, where his teenage son was likely still sleeping before Saturday basketball practice. The house with the wine cellar he'd personally designed, and the home office where he'd closed. Deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Call the Washington residence," David said calmly. "Lot 47, Ridgemont Drive. Ask for Susan Washington. She'll confirm I live there." Victoria's finger hovered over her radio. Something in his voice gave her pause, not because she believed him, but because he spoke with the kind of quiet certainty that came from never having to prove obvious truths. Still, protocol was protocol. Rich neighborhoods attracted con artists and trespassers precisely because they looked wealthy. She'd been fooled before by smooth talkers with convincing stories. "I'm sorry, but I cannot make personal calls to residents based on the claims of unidentified individuals," Victoria said. "If you truly live here, you'll understand why we maintain strict security measures." "Everything okay here, Victoria?" "Claims to be a resident, but has no identification, no vehicle, no visitor authorization." Martinez set down his coffee and approached the gate, studying David with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of distinguishing between threats and nuisances, or intoxication. Still, Victoria was the boss, and she'd been doing this job longer than anyone. "If you need to contact someone inside the community, there's a visitor phone at the side entrance that connects directly to residents." David Washington looked from Martinez to Victoria, then back to the gate that separated him from his own driveway. For a moment, something passed. Across his face, a flash of something deeper than frustration. It was the look of a man who'd spent decades climbing mountains, only to be told he still couldn't reach the summit. "Officer Martinez," David said, reading the name tag on the guard's uniform. "How long have you worked here?" Martinez glanced. At Victoria, uncertain about 6 months. "Sir." "Why?" "Because in 6 months, you probably haven't seen every resident, haven't memorized every face, haven't learned every routine." David's voice remained steady, almost teaching. "But Mrs. Sterling here, 12 years on the job. She should know that the man in Lot 47 jogs past this gate every Saturday morning at 7:30. Victoria's spine stiffened. There was something unsettling about how he spoke her name, how he knew her tenure, how he moved through information, like he had access to details that should have been private. "How do you know my employment history?" she demanded. David smiled then, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who'd been underestimated so many times that the shock had worn off, replaced by something closer to pity. "Your paychecks?" he said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Martinez blinked. Victoria's face went pale, then red, then pale again. From across the street, a jogger slowed to watch the confrontation, phone already in hand. "I don't know what game you're playing," Victoria said, her voice shaking slightly, "but impersonating a homeowner is a serious offense. Martinez, call it in." Martinez hesitated, looking between his supervisor and the man at the gate. Something in David Washington's eyes made him pause. There was no panic, no desperation, no fear of being caught in a lie. There was only the patient certainty of someone who knew exactly what would happen next. "Ma'am," Martinez said carefully, "maybe we should verify before we escalate. If he knows your name, your tenure, maybe we should check the system more carefully." Victoria whirled on him. "Are you questioning my judgment, Officer Martinez?" "No. Ma'am, I just think you think we should take the word of a man with no identification over established security protocol." Victoria's voice rose. "You think we should open gates for anyone who knows how to look up employee information online." David Washington pulled his phone from his hoodie pocket. The device was expensive, sleek, the kind carried by people who could afford the latest technology. Victoria noticed but dismissed it. Anyone could steal a phone. Anyone could pretend to wealth they didn't possess. "I'm calling my wife," David said, scrolling through his contacts. "She's inside right now. She can bring my identification to the gate, sir." "Step away from the gate while you make your call," Victoria ordered. "Security protocols require non-residents to maintain distance from entry points." David looked at her steadily. "I'm not stepping away from my own gate to call my own wife to prove I live in my own house." The standoff stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Behind Victoria, Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Across the street, More people had begun to notice the confrontation. A woman, walking her dog, stopped and pulled out her phone. Two teenagers on skateboards slowed to watch. Victoria's hand moved to her radio. Her training told her to de-escalate, but her instincts told her to maintain control. In her experience, the moment you showed weakness, the moment you bent protocol for one person, that's when everything fell apart. That's when property values dropped, when crime crept in, when the very character of the neighborhood changed forever. "This is your final warning," Victoria announced, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Leave the premises immediately, or I will contact local law enforcement." David Washington looked at his phone, then at Victoria, then at the gate that had kept him locked out of his own home for the past 10 minutes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Martinez take an unconscious step backward. "Mrs. Sterling," David said, "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that when you had the chance to show dignity, to show basic human respect, to simply ask questions before making assumptions, you chose this instead." He pressed a contact on his phone. It rang once before. A crisp female voice answered. "Washington Residence, this is Susan." Victoria could hear the voice clearly through the speaker. Professional, warm, unmistakably coming from inside the community. "Susan, it's David. I'm at the front gate. There seems to be some confusion about my residency status." A pause. Then Susan Washington's voice, now edged with concern and growing anger. "Confusion? David, what do you mean confusion? You live there. We've lived there for 3 years." Victoria's face went white. Martinez stepped forward, studying David with new eyes. Across the street, phones were rising as more people realized they were witnessing something significant. "Ma'am?" Susan's voice continued, now addressing Victoria directly. "This is Susan Washington, resident of 47 Ridgemont Drive. The man you're speaking to is my husband, David Washington, homeowner and resident. Is there a problem?" Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came, because suddenly the pieces were clicking into place in ways she didn't want them to. The expensive phone, the calm confidence, the way he spoke about signing paychecks, the way he knew her employment history. David looked directly into Victoria's eyes as he spoke to his wife. "No problem, honey. Just a misunderstanding about identification. But I think it's about to be resolved." Behind them, Martinez was already pulling up additional screens on his tablet, scrolling through property records, resident information, vehicle registrations. His face grew more concerned with each swipe. "Mrs. Sterling," Martinez said quietly, "we might have a situation here." Victoria didn't turn around. She couldn't take her eyes off David Washington because something in his expression had changed. The patience was still there, but underneath it, something else was building. Something that looked like justice warming up in the morning sun. Crowd across the street had grown. Someone was live streaming. The woman with the dog was shaking her head in disbelief. And Victoria Sterling, head of security for Ridgemont Estates, was beginning to realize that the man she'd been trying to keep out might actually have the power to keep her in, or out. Forever, Victoria Sterling's world tilted on its axis when Martinez looked up from his tablet, his face drained of color. "Mrs. Sterling," he whispered, "David Washington isn't just a resident, he's listed as the primary shareholder of Ridgemont Development Corporation." The words hit the air like a physical force. Victoria's knees nearly buckled. Ridgemont Development. The corporation wasn't just any company, it was the firm that owned the entire neighborhood. The security contracts, the maintenance agreements. It was the company that ultimately employed every person standing at that gate, including her. David Washington heard Martinez's whispered revelation and nodded slowly. "Officer Martinez is correct," he said, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "I don't just live in Ridgemont Heights, I built it." The phone in David's hand buzzed. Susan's voice came through again, but this time she sounded different, sharper. "David, I just got off the phone with our attorney. He's reviewing the security footage from the gate camera right now. Should I have him conference in the board of directors?" Victoria's face went from pale to gray. The board of directors, the people who could end her career with a single vote. The people who'd hired her personally 12 years ago, based on her promise to maintain the highest standards of security and service, the people who paid her salary, her benefits, her pension, that "Won't be necessary just yet," David replied, but his eyes never left Victoria's face. "I'm hoping this can be resolved professionally." But the damage was already spreading like water through broken concrete. The live stream that had started with a few curious onlookers now had hundreds of viewers. Comments were flying past too, fast to read, but the themes were clear. Security guard blocking the actual owner. This is 2025. Really? CEO can't enter his own property. Behind Victoria, two more security officers had emerged from the main booth. Johnson, a 20-year veteran with gray temples, and Thompson, newer to the force, but sharp and observant. They'd both heard Martinez's revelation, and their faces showed the same dawning horror that was spreading through Victoria's chest. Mrs. Sterling Johnson said carefully, "If Mr. Washington owns the development corporation, then technically, I know what it means." Victoria snapped, but her authority was crumbling like sand in a storm. She turned back to David, desperation creeping into her voice. "If you are who you say you are, then you'll understand why we have to be careful. We've had incidents, people trying to gain access by impersonating residents." David tilted his head, slightly. "When was the last incident like that?" Victoria hesitated. "Last month we had a man claiming to be visiting the Henderson family." "And what happened?" "We verified with the Hendersons, and they confirmed he was lying." David nodded slowly. "So you called the homeowners to verify? Like Officer Martinez suggested you do with me 10 minutes ago." The logic hit Victoria like a slap. She had followed protocol for a white man claiming to visit white residents, but she hadn't extended the same courtesy to a black man claiming to be a resident himself. The hypocrisy hung in the air, visible to everyone present, including the cameras now recording from multiple angles. From across the street, an elderly woman in a Mercedes had pulled over and rolled down her window. "Victoria!" she called out. "What's all the commotion? Is everything all right?" Victoria's heart sank further. Mrs. Patterson, resident of Lot 15, neighborhood busybody, and worst of all, someone who knew every detail of community politics. If word of this incident reached the wrong ears, Victoria's career would be over before lunch. "Just a small security matter, Mrs. Patterson," Victoria called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing to worry about." But David Washington had heard enough. He pressed another contact on his phone. This time, when it connected, he put it on speaker for everyone to hear. Washington residence, administrative line, came a professional voice. "This is David Washington. Please connect me to Paul Henderson, head of the Ridgemont Homeowners Association." Victoria's blood turned to ice. Paul Henderson wasn't just the HOA president, he was the most influential voice in neighborhood politics. The man who could make or break careers with a single recommendation. If David Washington really was calling Paul Henderson directly, if he really had that kind of access, Mr. Washington, came Paul Henderson's voice through the speaker, warm and familiar. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Paul, I'm standing at the main security gate, and there seems to be some confusion about my residency status. Mrs. Sterling is refusing me entry to my own home." A long pause, then Paul Henderson's voice, now cold as winter. "Victoria Sterling is refusing you entry? The man who owns 40% of this neighborhood? The man whose investment made this community possible." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Around her, the security team was backing away slowly, distancing themselves from a situation that was spiraling beyond control. Across the street had grown to nearly a dozen people, and cars were slowing down to see what was happening. "Paul," David continued, "I'd like you to review the security footage from the past 15 minutes. I'd also like you to schedule an emergency board meeting for this afternoon to discuss security protocols and training procedures." "Consider it done," Henderson replied. "David, I'm personally coming down there right now. This is absolutely unacceptable." Victoria's hands were shaking now. 12 years of perfect service, 12 years of maintaining order. 12 years of protecting property values, and it was all dissolving because she'd looked at a man in a hoodie and seen a threat instead of an owner. David ended the call and looked at Victoria with something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Sterling," he said softly, "in the next 5 minutes, Paul Henderson is going to drive down that hill and confirm everything I've told you. The security camera is going to show you denying entry to a homeowner without cause, And somewhere in Ridgemont Development Corporation's legal department, lawyers are going to start asking very serious questions about liability and discrimination. Victoria's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I was just doing my job." "No," David replied, his voice gentle but firm. "You were making assumptions. There's a difference." Behind the gate, a black Bentley was making its way down the hill, moving faster than the usual leisurely pace of Ridgemont Drive. Paul Henderson was coming, and with him, the confirmation that would change everything. Victoria Sterling looked at the gate controls, at her radio, at the badge that had given her authority for over a decade. For the first time in 12 years, she wondered if she'd still be wearing it tomorrow. The Bentley's engine grew louder, and with it, the sound of Victoria's career grinding toward an end she never saw coming. Paul Henderson's Bentley pulled up to the gate with the quiet authority of money and influence. The window rolled down to reveal a distinguished man in his 60s, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a weekend polo that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Victoria," Henderson called out, not bothering to get out of the car. "Open this gate immediately." Victoria's hands trembled as she fumbled with the gate controls. The electronic lock disengaged with a soft click, and Henderson drove through, parking just inside the entrance. When he stepped out, his eyes went straight to David Washington. "David, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am about this situation," Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "This is absolutely inexcusable." David nodded acknowledgement, but didn't move to shake Henderson's extended hand. "Paul, this isn't about apologies. This is about patterns." Henderson's face tightened. He turned to Victoria, who was standing frozen by the security booth like a deer caught in headlights. "Mrs. Sterling, would you care to explain why you've been denying entry to the man who owns this entire community?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound. Behind her, Martinez, Johnson, and Thompson stood in a line, all looking anywhere except at their supervisor. The weight of their collective realization was crushing. They'd all participated in blocking their ultimate boss from his own property. I didn't recognize him," Victoria finally stammered. "He wasn't in his vehicle. He didn't have identification. He was dressed like ... double quotes like what?" David asked quietly, stepping forward. "Like someone who doesn't belong here?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be denied, because that's exactly what Victoria had thought. She'd seen a black man in workout clothes and immediately categorized him as a threat, an outsider, someone who needed to be kept away from the wealthy white residents she was paid to protect. From the growing crowd across the street, someone shouted, "That's discrimination." Another voice added, "In 2025, really?" The live stream viewer count had climbed past 1,000, and news alerts were already starting to appear on social media. He glanced at it, and his face darkened further. "David, I'm getting calls from board members. Word is spreading fast." David pulled out his own phone and dialed another number. When it connected, he didn't put it on speaker this time, but his voice carried clearly in the morning air. "This is David Washington. I need an emergency meeting with all department heads in 1 hour. We have a serious company culture issue that requires immediate attention." Victoria felt her legs grow weak. Department heads, company culture issues, the language of corporate restructuring, of people being removed from positions they'd held for years. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice cracking, "please, I've worked here for 12 years. I've never had a complaint, never had an incident. This was just a misunderstanding." David ended his call and looked at Victoria with eyes that held no anger, but also no mercy. "Mrs. Sterling, in 12 years, how many black residents have you?" Asked for additional identification, Victoria's mouth went dry. I don't keep track of." "How many black delivery drivers have you required to use side entrances while white drivers came through the main gate?" "That's not we don't how. Many times have you assumed someone didn't belong based on how they looked rather than who they were?" The questions came like hammer blows, each one exposing a pattern Victoria had never acknowledged but couldn't deny. Behind her, Martinez was shaking his head slowly. He'd seen it too, the double standards, the different treatment, but he'd never spoken up because Victoria was the boss. Henderson stepped forward, his voice now carrying the authority of his position. "Mrs. Sterling, effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation. Please turn in your badge, your radio, and your access cards." Victoria's hands shook as she unclipped the radio from her belt. "Mr. Henderson, please. I have a mortgage. I have kids in college. This job is everything to me. And this neighborhood is everything to our residents," Henderson replied firmly. "All of our residents, regardless of how they choose to dress on a Saturday morning." David Washington watched as Victoria fumbled with her badge, trying to remove it from the lanyard around her neck. When she couldn't manage it with her shaking hands, he stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," he said gently, reaching out to assist her. The gesture was so unexpected, so kind after everything she'd put him through, that Victoria began to cry. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears that spoke to the magnitude of what she'd lost through her own prejudice. "Mr. Washington," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." David finished removing her badge and handed it to Henderson. "Mrs. Sterling, I believe you are sorry. But sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't change the fact that if I had been a white man in a suit, you would have called my house to verify my identity before you threatened to call the police." The truth of his words settled over everyone present like a heavy blanket. There was no denying it, no explaining it away. The discrimination had been clear, documented, and witnessed by dozens of people and hundreds of online viewers. Martinez stepped forward, removing his own badge. "Mr. Washington, I was complicit in this. I should have questioned the protocols when they didn't make sense." David looked at the young officer with something approaching respect. Officer Martinez, recognizing a mistake takes courage. What matters now is what you do next. Johnson and Thompson exchanged glances, then simultaneously began removing their own badges. The entire security team was collapsing, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood that their silence had made them participants in something wrong. Henderson collected the badges and radios, shaking his head. "David, I'll have a new security team in place by Monday. This will never happen again." But David Washington wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone once more and dialed the number that made Henderson's eyes widen. "Channel 7 News. This is David Washington, CEO of Washington Technologies. I have a story for you about discrimination in high-end communities, and I have video evidence." The livestream comments exploded. CEO fighting back. "This is how you handle discrimination. Justice." In real time, Victoria Sterling looked around at the crowd, the cameras, the badges in Henderson's hands, and the man she'd tried to keep out of his own home. Everything she'd built over 12 years was gone, destroyed in 15 minutes by her own prejudice and pride as the Channel 7 news van pulled up to the curb. David Washington finally walked through his own gate, not as a vindicated victim, but as a man who'd just taught an entire community that dignity isn't determined by dress code, and respect isn't reserved for people who look the part. The gate clicked shut behind him, but the lesson remained open for everyone to see. The morning sun climbed higher over Ridgemont Heights, but for Victoria Sterling and her former security team, their day was already over. Justice, it turned out, didn't need business hours to show up for work. This story reminds us that true power isn't about controlling gates, it's about opening doors. At Hidden Sparks, we believe every person deserves dignity, regardless of how they're dressed or where they come from. Like and subscribe. If you agree that respect should be universal, not conditional,